So many of you will know Jonathan. He has a long and varied career. He was chief economist for the Department of Work and Pensions and also for the Cabinet Office. So he has an in-depth knowledge of the machinery of government, but he has also been director of National Institute of Economic Research, and he is currently Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's and Senior Fellow of the ESRC's UK in Changing Europe. And he's recently published a really important and informative book on immigration. What do we know and what should we do? So it's a bit of a banal thing to say. We live in very turbulent times, lots of uncertainty, but we hope that Jonathan can bring some light to what's been going on over the last few months and perhaps into the future. So thank you again for Jonathan for agreeing to do this, and I will now hand over to him for the talk.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian, for that kind introduction, and thanks to Wizard for inviting me. As Ian said, this is we are, of course, in uncertain times, but in challenging ones, but absolutely fascinating, I think, for economists and social science in general. And I think it's, before I start the lecture, just a couple of reflections on the role of economics, but more social science more broadly in the in current circumstances. I think one of the things we've learned over the past couple of months is that the idea that there is a hard distinction when it comes to policy making between hard science like virology and perhaps epidemiology and social science is misplaced. The idea that you can have simply objective, impartial, purely quantitative, hard scientific advice on the nature of a virus on the one hand, and take decisions of that entirely divorced from these broader social science considerations of impacts of the economy, how people will behave, questions of law, culture, how government, civil service, the private sector and wider society reacts to these events. That doesn't work. We are all in this together, and making good policy requires us to be in it together. A virus is a biological phenomenon, but a pandemic is by definition a social phenomenon. And what we have to deal with from a policy point of view is, of course, the pandemic and its broader health, medical, economic, and social consequences. In my view, that doesn't mean that we economists, or indeed quantitative social scientists more broadly, should, as some of my colleagues have, often in my view with not particularly useful results, decide, oh, we can just take our economic models off the shelf, turn them into epidemiological models, and start giving better advice to governments than from people who've spent their lives working on these issues. But equally, that does not mean that we should butt out entirely and simply leave it to SAGE and the scientists who sit on SAGE. Epidemiologists, economists, and all the rest of us, from sociologists to lawyers to experts in public opinion to behavioral scientists to public health specialists, have to work together, and we have to learn from each other and hopefully contribute both to better policy making in the short term, but also to where we go from here over the next few years what happens to our economy and society, and how we can, I hope, reshape it for the better. And I guess just one observation on specifically on what that means for Wales. Clearly, Wales faces particular economic and social challenges emerging from the pandemic related to its position, particularly its economic position as being highly dependent on the broader English and UK economy, without necessarily the levers that it would need either to reshape that dependence in a rebalance that dependence in a way which would give it more economic autonomy, or to go it alone. It doesn't have either the capacity or power to do that. So for better or worse, Wales is bound up with what happens to the rest of the UK, and that's fine. That has been the case for many centuries and will continue to be so. But I think one of the advantages that Wales and Scotland do have in terms of how the social science community approaches this is that it is just easier to do interdisciplinary work and to see that work be influential, listened to and incorporated in by government in Cardiff as it is in Edinburgh than it is in London, quite frankly. And I've noticed in my own interactions with the devolved administrations over the past 2 years, I've done work in Scotland, work in Northern Ireland, and most extensively work in Wales, and in particularly on the implications of Brexit for the Welsh migration to Wales and Welsh immigration, the impact of immigration after Brexit on the Welsh labour market. I've noticed that the interaction between social scientists and government officials is more constructive and more productive in Cardiff as it is in Edinburgh than in general it is in Whitehall and Westminster. So I think there is an opportunity for social science to make a positive difference through initiatives in centres like Wizard, like my colleagues in the Welsh Centre for Public Policy, who I've worked with over the years, and I hope that will be true as we emerge from the pandemic. So that was sort of by way of preamble about social science. Let me come on to the economy and the UK economy in general, in particular, and just try and give a sense of where we are now. And I'll try and be a little, perhaps uncharacteristically for economists in general and me in particular, but start with some of the optimistic perspectives. So the headline is that the UK economy is probably growing faster than it ever has in recorded economic history. We'll find out in a week or so what the growth rate for the UK was in May, but I'd expect it to be pretty strongly positive, and that's probably true in June as well. So in terms of the raw numbers, we are seeing extremely fast growth, of the order of 5 or 10% a month, perhaps. That's obviously not surprising, given how sharp the fall in economic activity was in April, down about 25% relative to February. But also on the encouraging side, the first leg of that recovery does appear to be V-shaped. If you look at the indicators we have so far, retail sales, the PMI indices, they suggest that not only are we not plateauing at a low level, we're not recovering slowly. Actually, the recovery is We don't know yet if it's as fast as the descent, but it doesn't appear to be much slower. So far, the data is consistent with a V-shaped recovery. And I would also say that that has, I think, vindicated those economists, and I think the vast majority of economists, including me, but pretty much across the ideological and economic spectrum, who said that a hard, sharp lockdown was broadly the right approach, and that it was the precondition for economic recovery was to suppress the virus and to ensure that restrictions could be lifted relatively safely. By contrast, if you look at what's happened in places where they decided that the economics, the damage being done by lockdowns was such that you had to lift the lockdowns before the virus had been definitively suppressed, notably some states in the US, what you are seeing there is precisely what economists have said, which is not only has there been a resurgence in the virus, but more from an economic point of view, there has also been a slowing of recovery, or indeed perhaps even a fall back into a second leg of the economic downturn. In other words, what places like Florida and Texas have done appears to have been the wrong strategy, not just from a health perspective, which is obvious, but also from an economic perspective. Even from a narrow economic perspective, loosening the lockdown on economic grounds was the wrong thing to do on economic grounds. And as I said, I think that most economists warned against that, and I think we've been right. Now, does that tell you whether the government is loosening the lockdown here too early, too late, or roughly the right time? We don't know that. We won't know for a while. But to the extent that they're loosening it in line with scientific advice, that it is done at a pace which minimizes the risk of what we're seeing in some US states, then we can be reasonably optimistic, I hope, on the economic side. And I think so far at least we have seen relatively little evidence of widespread business failure or mass redundancies. Now that may seem to contradict what we've seen in the headlines, with thousands of jobs going at Pret-a-Manger or British Airways or whatever. But actually, if you look at the numbers involved there, so far they are not, by the standards of the UK economy, we are not talking huge numbers. They are not even at the scale of the last recession, and overall the last recession was relatively moderate in employment terms. Remember, the UK economy in normal times, about 10,000 people lose their jobs every day in the UK economy. About another 20,000 or 15 to 20,000 change jobs or move jobs. So 10,000 redundancies actually isn't that many. I mean, that may sound heartless to those people who have lost their jobs at retailers over the last few days. But so far, those numbers are not what I would describe as evidence of really mass redundancies of the sort with the impact that we saw when I was growing up in the late 70s and early 80s, when you genuinely had tens of thousands of redundancies being announced every day. So far, we have not seen that. So those are the reasons to be optimistic. As yet, what we have seen is not inconsistent with a V-shaped recovery. What should then we be worried about? Well, on the health side, I think I won't say anything more about this, but clearly, to the extent that there is a risk of a significant resurgence of the virus, that clearly is a worry. But that, I think, turns into what we should be, from as social scientists, perhaps focus a bit more on, which is the impact on public trust and confidence of the government's mishandling of the second phase of the crisis. I think, in general, after the delayed lockdown, the government's handling of the first phase of the lockdown was very well observed by the public and generally commanded public confidence. That's much less obvious with the second phase, partly as a result of lack of strategy, partly a result of sort of bad luck, things like the Cummings affair. But there definitely is less public trust and confidence, and that in turn has the potential to impact economic development. If people do not believe they're safe, then it is going to be difficult or impossible to get consumers back into shops, businesses back investing, and so on. And then thirdly, I think the biggest single worry from a purely economic perspective is what happens to employment as the furlough scheme is phased out. Now, my view is that it is entirely right to phase out the furlough scheme. The point of the furlough scheme was to preserve jobs that were temporarily non-viable during the period of lockdown. If, as lockdown is removed, those jobs turn out not to be viable, then it does not make sense from an economic point of view, or indeed a social point of view, for the government to carry on paying companies that may no longer be viable to pay for people not to do jobs that may no longer be viable. The government needs then to pivot to creating new jobs and to subsidizing employment rather than to temporarily subsidizing non-employment. And that is what I hope we will see tomorrow. But that is, from the policy point of view, probably the trickiest part of this whole exercise. It is that shift from the furlough scheme, which is hugely ambitious, hugely expensive, and in my view, broadly appropriate and well designed, but in conceptual terms, relatively easy. You're simply paying companies to keep workers on their books while they're not working, to paying companies or workers to create new jobs. And that is much harder to do efficiently. Not impossible, but it is much harder. We have a lot of experience with schemes, job creation schemes, wage subsidy schemes, training schemes in this country. It is very mixed. We do have successful examples from, most obviously, from the last recession, the Future Jobs Fund, which did work quite successfully to create new jobs for young people. But if we think about what's needed now, we will be seeing hundreds of thousands of young people leaving school and university in the next 2 to 3 months, coming onto a labor market which normally would be able to adjust and to incorporate hundreds of thousands of new entrants. It seems implausible that in the current state of the economy and labor market, that market mechanism is going to work anything like the way that it currently does. Given that, there's a huge challenge for government. We need something like the Future Jobs Fund, but on a scale that is significantly larger than that fund, and we need it in the next month or two. And of course, going back to my point about this being the hard bit, it's relatively easy to introduce a scheme to subsidize employers to pay workers who are not working. Actually creating jobs requires local involvement. It requires legwork. It requires working with the private sector. It requires working with the voluntary sector on the ground across the country. That has not even started yet. We are leaving this very late indeed. And tomorrow is, I hope, not going to be too late, but it will require a positively Herculean effort by the government, by Job Centre Plus, by local governments, and by the private sector to engage in the sort of programs that we need. And I hope that the Chancellor will rise to that challenge tomorrow, but we will see. So what might this mean in terms of quantitatively? I'm sorry, that wasn't, let's go back to that. So here we show, I'm showing, this is from the Treasury's compilation of independent forecasts, what the consensus is out there about what the growth profile might look like. And I guess the 2 or 3 key points to note here. I think the first is that the consensus forecast is that the dip will now be somewhat lower than was initially feared or estimated. So the consensus forecast that year-on-year growth, which is pretty meaningless, of course, because it conflates the first few months when nothing very much happened with this V or U or whatever it is in the second half of the year. But the arithmetically, GDP will fall by 9% over the year of 2020. And that's somewhat better than what the Bank of England or the OBR were projecting a month or two ago, reflecting the fact that lockdown did not last for the entire second quarter, but actually was easing in May and June already. So that's good news. The dip might not be quite as bad as we expected. If April was the low point, that was 25% down on February compared to the 30 and 35% the OBR and Bank of England had penciled in. But the bad news is that the consensus is not projecting a full bounce back. If GDP growth is 6% in 2021, that still leaves GDP in 2021 3% lower than it was in 2019. So a significant medium-term hit to the economy, and correspondingly with unemployment still at a relatively elevated level. Even at the end of 2021, unemployment at 6.4%, which is it's perhaps 2.5% higher than it was at the beginning of this. So that's an extra million plus people unemployed. Even at the end of 2021, that is basically 18 months after lockdown had begun to come to an end. So that is a pretty, that's a pretty large permanent hit to the labor market implied here. The other thing which I think is notable here is the very wide dispersion of forecasts here. So if you look at the lowest and highest, at the highest end, you do have some forecasters who are projecting a near perfect V, that we will be basically back on trend by the end of 2021, and correspondingly that unemployment will be back at 4%, or roughly the pre-crisis level. Equally, the outlier on the minus side is that unemployment will still be at 9% by 2021, and that would be fully 5% or over 2 million higher than it was before the start of the crisis, even at the end of 2021, and that really would be absolutely horrendous. So the question which I think one needs to think about from an economic perspective then is, these are, you can regard these as forecasts in the sense that they're individual forecasts by individual forecasters, but perhaps a better way of thinking about them, given the uncertainty we face, is that, I wouldn't say, one should point at the individual forecaster at one end or the other of the spectrum and say, in a year's time, ha ha, you got it completely wrong. Obviously, one of them, if not all of them, will indeed have got it completely wrong. But I don't think that would be the right way of thinking about it. The right way of thinking about it is that these are scenarios for the course of the economy. And what I frequently like to say here is, look, assuming that we do indeed succeed in suppressing the virus more or less definitively now, and remember, infections now are down to relatively low levels, less than, a very small percentage of the population is infected. So the direct economic impacts of the virus should fade out fairly quickly. What happens now depends on us. What happens now is not a matter of virology, it's a matter of economics. If we end up with 4% unemployment, it's because we've done the right things and been lucky economically if we end up with 9% unemployment at the end of 2021, it will not be the virus's fault. It will be our fault. It will be because we've got the economics wrong, not for medical reasons. And I think it's really important to think about that, both so that we don't fall into the trap of pessimism and think, oh, we're all doomed, it's going to be dreadful. It doesn't have to be dreadful. And that we don't let the government off the hook by saying, oh, well, it was a result of the pandemic. It wasn't because the wrong policy choices were made. If we're at 9% at the end of 2021, it will be because the wrong policy choices are made. So the next step in thinking about this must be to ask ourselves, well, if these are scenarios rather than forecasts, bad scenarios, good scenarios, and what determines what scenario we follow? And so here, I try and work out why we might end up in the bad scenarios. Why might we end up with a permanent hit to GDP or productivity, or to a pervasive long-term mass unemployment? What might go wrong? And so most or all of you will have seen in the press very frequent references to scarring, to economic scarring, or the scarring impacts of unemployment. And what I'm trying to do in this slide is trying to unpick the ways in which that might occur. What economists call hysteresis impacts, the way in which a very sharp short-term fall in economic activity and rise in unemployment, as we're seeing now, could translate to permanent long-term damage to the economy and labor market. What are the channels that might occur through? And while you frequently see in the press references to the scarring impact of unemployment, I think that is an oversimplification. There are actually a number of different channels through which you can have permanent or scarring impacts on the economy. Not all of them are related to unemployment. And what I've tried to do here is unpick the different ways, and I've identified 5 different ways in which these short-term impacts might translate to long-term damage. And the first is this classic one, it's unemployment. We know that being unemployed, especially being long-term unemployed, does permanent damage to your labor market prospects. It damages your human capital. That's in maybe through a variety of ways. Maybe you lose your skills, you get out of the habit of work. Employers look at your CV and think this person can't be very good at their jobs because they were unemployed for a long term. A combination of these things, but all these things influence your future employment and wage prospects. So that's classic unemployment scarring. Related to that, but actually separate, is job separation. There is separate evidence that says simply losing your job, particularly during a recession, presumably because you have acquired certain firm-specific skills that relate to the actual company you're working for, that damages your earnings going forward, even if you're only unemployed for a relatively short period of time. So you get a job back. You don't suffer the unemployment scarring impacts, but simply job separation, involuntary job separation, especially during a recession, has a wage penalty. And that too is a scarring impact. The third, and again, separate channel that I identify is organizational capital. In other words, a firm, a company, can be viewed as a set of relationships, legal and contractual, both within the company and beyond it, legal and contractual relationships, social and personal relationships. We know, there's a whole theory of the firm. Why do firms exist in the first place? Why can't we all just engage in, be self-employed and engage in spot contracting with each other when we want to produce a project or do a job? Well, the answer is it's very inefficient. Firms reduce some of those transaction costs because they incorporate all these legal and social networks and contractual and non-contractual relationships. Firms going bust, in the normal way of things, of course, firms go bust all the time, and that's a good thing. What's happening is that firms that aren't terribly efficient, aren't very good at generating value through these relationships are destroyed and new firms are created. Some of those turn out to be efficient and worth preserving in a market economy, and hence they grow. So firm destruction creation increases productivity as the bad firms get weeded out naturally by the market. That's not what happens in a very, very severe recession, though, because you're destroying good, potentially viable firms at the same time. And clearly, this is an extreme example of that. So to the extent that good, efficient firms go under and new firms have to be created, that takes time. There's a permanent damage that comes from that. Fourth channel is education. We are taking kids out of school for 3 months. If we think education improves the human capital and hence the future and employment earning prospects of kids, and I think we certainly believe that, it's one of presumably the main motivation for sending kids to school in the first place. Not the only motivation, but obviously a key one. If we believe that education does work, then not educating kids is going to do them some permanent damage in terms of their employment and labor market prospects, unless we do something about it. And finally, business investment. Fairly obviously, business investment has fallen by a lot in the past 3 months and can probably stay depressed for a while. We don't know exactly how much, but it's impossible to believe there isn't an effect. To the extent that business investment is designed to improve productivity, then there will be permanent productivity impacts as a result. So we expect some hit from that. So what you see here in the table are my quantifications based on the existing literature of what the impact of these different channels might be on the potential output of the UK economy, both in the short to medium term and over the longer term. These are very back of the envelope. There is no huge science to this. They're based on a selective reading of the literature on each of these individual facets, and I won't hold myself or anyone else to them. For those who are interested, I've written a column on a short note explaining all this on voxeu.org, so you can go read about this. But this is my best attempt, and I think what I'm going to focus here is not on the estimates, but on the sort of profile. And what it shows, and perhaps this is what you'd expect, is that in the short term, what we should be worried about, short to medium term, is the firm-specific impacts. Job separation and organizational capital together account for the majority of the damage, and that relates to viable, good, efficient firms going under. So that's something we might be worried about in the short term. But in the longer term, those effects fade out. New firms get created, new efficient firms get created, and there what we're much more worried about is the human capital impacts, in particular the long-term impacts of unemployment and the long-term impacts on future workers of the education that they've lost. And those two, unemployment and education, account for the impact. And so that suggests to me a focus, again, the need for policy to pivot from a short-term policy very much of supporting existing firms and workers in existing jobs to, at some point, and I would not pretend to tell you exactly when, to focusing on human capital aspects, and in particular, unemployment and preventing long-term unemployment, and in catch-up education for those kids who have suffered as a consequence of the close down in education over the past few months. So that I think is an important way of, as I say, I won't place too much emphasis on numbers themselves, but I think the quantitative magnitude, relative magnitudes probably are right, and they should provide some guide as how policy should both be focused and should pivot as we come through this pandemic. So what does that mean in policy, hard policy terms? I think the first thing it tells me is that we really should not be, I do not see much of a case for generalized fiscal stimulus, VAT or other tax cuts in the short term. I can't see those as being the priority unless and until we have evidence of generalized deficiency in demand. and we just don't have that at the moment. It may come, but we're certainly not there yet. I think it would be a big mistake if that was what the focus was on now. By contrast, the focus should, in my view, be on the managing the furlough scheme in such a way as to preserve viable jobs, but to phase it out relatively quickly and replace it by policies that are targeted on people who are unemployed, either as a result of the ending of the furlough scheme or young people coming onto the labor market, through some sort of opportunity guarantee for young people and generalized support through wage subsidies or national insurance cuts or subsidies for employers creating new jobs or workers taking up new jobs. And then over the longer term, investment in infrastructure, in public services, the NHS and care, both of which could be expected to create jobs if done well, and to rebuilding the resilience of our welfare state. And I'll probably say more about the policy stuff in response to questions. But before that, I do want to turn to Brexit as the other half of the challenges facing the UK economy before I come back and try and draw it together with a reference to how the interaction between Brexit and COVID. So on Brexit, last Wednesday, June the 30th, was the last day for the UK to propose an extension of the transition period. And as we all know, they did not do that. And it is now very difficult indeed, both legally and politically, for the government to change course. So what does that mean? It means that the transition period will end, deal or no deal, on December the 31st, and we will be in a new relationship with the EU, either with or without a deal. Will there be then a deal? And I think there are basically at the moment 4 key issues on preventing or that are major obstacles to concluding a deal, and these are the following. The first is fish, not an issue of huge economic significance, but one of huge political and symbolic significance on both sides of the channel. It's hugely politically symbolic here, but we shouldn't forget that it's actually very politically symbolic for a number of European countries as well. And it's that makes it most difficult. There has to be a compromise which enables both sides to save face and both sides to preserve the interests of their fishing communities. That is potentially feasible, but it requires some eating of words on both sides of the channel. The second, much more substantive economically, is, and probably the biggest single obstacle, is on state aids and subsidies to industry. Here it's quite clear that the EU is not going to do a free trade deal with the UK that does not include some fairly meaningful guarantees on what the UK subsidy regime looks like, not just immediately after Brexit, but in the future. And I think, we have to recognise that their concerns here are not unreasonable, given the trajectory of this government. This is not a Thatcherite government when it comes to industrial policy and state intervention. It's not one that seeks, as the Thatcher government very much did, to bind itself both domestically and externally through the EU to not subsidizing domestic industries. It's a government that wants to subsidize domestic industries and wants to keep a free hand to do so. So this is not a theoretical risk for the EU. It's not something like, whereas on environmental labour standards, where I think the UK government can quite reasonably say, we have environmental and labour standards that are set by the EU at the moment. We have no intention of regressing from that. In fact, on some things we may want to go further. And moreover, the political economy of the UK is not, and is unlikely to be in the foreseeable future, one that prioritizes a significant rollback of environmental labour standards in a way that will pose a competitive disadvantage to the EU. Of course, there are people in the Conservative Party and Conservative government who would like to do exactly that. There are people who would like us to become Hong Kong on Thames. It ain't going to happen. It's not the Johnson-Cummings model for the UK economy, and even if it were, it's not something that's politically viable for the UK. So I think we can reasonably say to the UK, the EU, you haven't got that much to worry about. We can make some promises and put some stuff in, but you don't need to tie down every last detail here. That, however, is not the case on state aids, and hence that second bullet here is one where I think the biggest obstacles to a deal are likely to come. And then finally on governance, which sounds like a rather bureaucratic thing, because what we're talking about here is the EU's desire to have one agreement that within which are nestled a number of different chapters on trade, on security, on data sharing, and the rest of it, and the UK's desire to have lots of different agreements. Surely we can draft around this. Yes, well, maybe, but it conceals a more substantive point, which is that the EU emphatically does not want an arrangement paralleling the one that they have with Switzerland, which is a large number of bilateral agreements. The EU feels that is inflexible, difficult, and reduces its bargaining power. So there is a substantive issue here behind the bureaucratic facade that will have to be resolved one way or another. Now, my view is that all of these issues are resolvable, but there is a potential landing zone, as the bureaucrats say, and both sides do indeed want a deal, but somebody has to blink, and on precedent, that has to be us. In other words, we will have to make a meaningful move on one, if not all, of these issues if we want to unblock the talks. And I am unclear as yet as to whether the government really wants to do that or not. So I think the ball is mostly in our court. A deal is possible. A deal that would suit the interests of both sides is possible, but we'll have to make a move. But perhaps a bigger question is, well, how much does it matter? A deal along the lines that I've suggested would mean zero tariffs and quotas for most goods. So that's okay. Well, yes and no. Such a deal wouldn't necessarily cover all goods. It's not clear how far it would go, particularly on things like agricultural goods. And even if it did, you would still need rules of origin, checks on food, checks on SPS checks. There would be limited provisions for mutual recognition or equivalence, and limited or no provisions on labor mobility. In other words, all the non-tariff barriers that the EU currently has for third countries, all or most of them, would still happen with the UK, even if we made a deal on the lines I've suggested. What does all that add up to? Well, economically, what that means is that the difference between no deal and a deal, a skinny deal of the sort that I've outlined, is actually much smaller than the difference between a skinny deal and EU membership. The bottom line then is that the UK faces very major changes to the trading relationship with the EU on the 1st of January, deal or no deal. In some sense, a deal does not, from a purely economic perspective, make nearly as much difference as you would think from the press. And in fact, in my view, the biggest risk of no deal is political rather than economic. In other words, the risk of no deal is not that it means that there will be some tariffs and quotas. Yes, there will be, but actually that's just adding insult to injury in terms of the economic damage that is already done through the non-tariff barriers I've described. The biggest risk is that no deal poisons our relationship in a number of other ways, on fishing, on Northern Ireland, and that damages the UK's relationship to the EU on a political front for the foreseeable future. And I think that would be very unfortunate, but it's much less of an economic issue than a political issue. And you can see that in this analysis. This was our analysis, but it's very similar to the UK government's own analysis of the direct economic damage of different deals. The direct economic damage of a deal along a skinny deal, along the lines of what Johnson is proposing, is 2.5% of GDP. That of no deal, WTO, moving to WTO rules is 3%. In other words, you get 2/3 or 3/4 of the economic damage simply by having, even if you have a deal, and moving to no deal at all to WTO doesn't do much extra damage. And I think that's really important. There'll be a lot of noise about whether or not there's a deal in the autumn. But economically, the die has already been cast. We are already undertaking a major reshaping of our trading relationship with major new trade barriers with the EU on the 1st of January, come what may. And that in turn raises the question of, well, how does that interact with what I talked about in the first half of my talk, the COVID crisis? Does COVID crisis raise or lower the costs of a hard Brexit? The honest answer here is we really don't know, and I don't think that economists who claim that the answer is clear-cut one way or the other are really doing themselves a service through being definitive in this way. I genuinely don't know. There are arguments both ways. On the plus side, I think there is a legitimate argument that it's easier to deal with the adjustments of Brexit, more barriers to trade, and less risk of disruption at the ports when you have trade, travel, tourism, and immigration already disrupted and reduced as a consequence of COVID. David Davis made this argument, but the fact that David Davis made this argument doesn't necessarily mean it's total nonsense. It may still have some validity, and I think in this case it does. The second, more economist argument is that adjustment costs are overlap. Both COVID and Brexit represent a significant shock to the UK economy. The UK economy has to adjust. Firms will go bust, new firms will be created. If you're going to have those big adjustments, maybe it's better to do them at once. Maybe the cost of two adjustments is bigger than the cost of one big adjustment. So there is a perfectly legitimate argument there that the costs of adjustment, both short-term and medium-term, will be lower if they all happen on December 31st. On the other hand, there are good arguments the other way, that you don't want additional disruption just when we are recovering from the pandemic and companies here, Europe, and in the world are rebuilding their supply chains after the crisis. Do we want to be left out of that for European companies? And that, I think, is magnified by what we've seen over, particularly just in the last few days, this considerable resetting of our relationship with China on a newer and much more negative political front, which almost certainly is going to translate into the economics. If global supply chains, and particularly those with China, are less viable, do we really want to be making supply chains with the rest of Europe less viable at the same time? That, it seems to me, is quite a big argument the other way. And finally, there's a simple overload argument that business and government are going to be in no shape to deal with the consequences of a hard Brexit on December 31st at this particular moment. Overall, my view is that the second set of arguments outweigh the first, that we are making things unnecessarily difficult for ourselves by committing to a hard Brexit immediately after the end of, just at the time when hopefully we are recovering from the pandemic. But as I said, I would not trust anyone who opines with excessive certainty on this particular topic. As I said at the beginning, huge uncertainties, but an absolutely fascinating time to be an economist or a social scientist more broadly, and one where I think we really, as a community, have both the opportunity and the obligation to try and contribute to rebuilding and reshaping the economy of the UK and of Wales as we come out of this, hopefully for the better. And I'll end it there and take questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that very timely and hugely informative talk. I guess what we don't have is time, and the kind of decisions that are going to be made in the next few weeks, as you've eloquently pointed out, are going to have very profound effects on the social and economic fabric of the UK. But also, in the words of Ian Dury, there are reasons to be cheerful, which is what I like to hear. Now I'm going to set myself up for a fall here, so I'm going to try and walk and chew gum at the same time, which means trying to organise some questions that Jonathan has kindly agreed to take. So just a reminder, if you have a question, could you type it in to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen when you click on Q&A, and to say if you want to ask the question, start the question with talk, And as the questions come in, I will give Chloe a list of people to allow access to the forum. So I need to give people a bit of time to do that. So maybe one way in which I could do that is to ask a couple of questions myself to give people time. And maybe I could ask a question about the effects of COVID or the response to COVID and on Brexit. So one thing we spoke about earlier, Jonathan, was this idea of key workers, and Wales in particular has a higher proportion of key workers. And I wonder whether there are opportunities there for this active role of government to subsidise existing jobs in those sectors and perhaps to expand some jobs that you mentioned, health and care, for example.
I mean, absolutely. I think one thing that is obvious, I mean, it was obvious before the crisis, but the crisis has obviously thrown into very sharp relief, is that we have underfunded and understaffed social care for, well, getting on 2 decades now, probably, but very much over the past 10 years. And we are, sadly, many of our old people have paid the price of that. And so it seems obvious, both from an economic and a social policy point of view, that improving both the wages, the conditions, the training, and the numbers and staffing of people in the social care sector ought to be perhaps the single most obvious policy priority coming out of this. There is an opportunity to train young people, to give them jobs, and to give them jobs that are hopefully better, more rewarding, and more fulfilling, and more decent jobs than have been available in that sector in the past.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. We've got one question from Christabel Cooper. Christabel, are you able to unmute and you could ask Jonathan?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. A lot of your analysis and policy prescriptions seem to assume that this lockdown is going to be it, and we're going to be opening up fairly steadily from now onwards. However, in the event that there is a second wave or even further waves which keep necessitating further lockdowns, do your policy prescriptions change, or do they broadly stay the same?
I think that if they are localized, as we've seen in Leicester, for example, or indeed Merthyr Tydfil in Wales, then a proportionate local lockdowns which don't really derail the broader economic policy prescription seem to me appropriate. And which doesn't seem likely now, but as you say, it can't be ruled out, and presumably contingency planning is going on. If you saw widespread community transition again, then I think you would have no alternative but to go for a further second and probably more severe lockdown. If we do see a genuine full second wave, then that will have told us that what we did the first time around wasn't enough, that just suppressing it to a few hundred infections a day across the country, which I think is what we're seeing now, isn't good enough. You need total suppression a la New Zealand or whatever. So we'd have to do it again and do it harder, and we'd have to take the economic consequences of that, which would be quite painful, I think. As I say, from my non-expert perspective, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. It seems to me more likely that we will have, there will be the occasional flare-up, but that you'll be able to control it on a local level without really interfering with the national strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We've got questions coming in thick and fast now. So this one might be cheating, but I've got two questions from Mehdi Askarieh. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's about government performance. So how is the non-ideological government performing across the board over the whole spectrum?
I mean, my view is that, you know, the government, I think I identify three parts to this, say. So the first was the failure to lock down quickly, was clearly a huge mistake and has cost possibly tens of thousands of lives. On the other hand, I also think it's understandable making difficult decisions with huge consequences under pressure with very, very uncertain analysis that was recognized at the time as being uncertain. Can I put my hand on my heart and say I wouldn't have made the same mistake? Honestly, no, I can't. And so, you know, we need to find out what happened, but do I think that that people should necessarily be blamed for that, tragic as the consequences were? I'm not sure they are. The second, however, I think is much less excusable, which is the failure to put in place a contact tracing infrastructure. In fact, to dismantle the contact tracing infrastructure that was going right at the beginning of the epidemic, and then not do anything basically for 2 months except faff around with an app which didn't work for a while. Given that the day we went into lockdown, we knew that we needed an exit strategy for lockdown, since you can't possibly lock down forever. We knew we were going to have to exit at some point, and we knew with a very high probability that part of the exit strategy was going to be contact tracing. So for the life of me, I do not understand why the government was not working flat out from that on that from March 23rd. And it absolutely clearly wasn't. And that to me seems to be entirely inexcusable, and really someone should take the blame for that. Finally, on the economics, I think so far the government has done pretty much the right thing at the right time across the board. It's done large, big schemes, not worried too much about what we economists call deadweight costs, not worried at all about borrowing. To me, it is learned, you know, what we've done, I think, is what, you know, we've learned the lessons of the last time. If you asked Gordon Brown, what did he do wrong in 2008-9, he'd say, we didn't do enough. We did a lot and it sort of worked, but we didn't do enough fast enough. And I think the Treasury and government have learned from that. And this time they have broadly done enough and fast enough. On the other hand, I also think in sort of design terms, it was the easy bit. You know, the furlough scheme is incredibly ambitious and expensive, but it was not that complicated to design. So actually, as I said in my talk, getting the next bit right is the hard bit, and that's where they'll really be tested.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Calvin Jones. Calvin, if you can unmute, thanks.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, lovely. Thanks so much for that, Jonathan. Very interesting stuff. So my question is a bit broader than just the kind of COVID crisis. What I've noticed in the kind of Twitter sphere and in chats more generally, certainly in Wales, is COVID surfacing quite a lot of issues that were already bubbling away around basic restructuring of the economic system. Things like universal basic income, moving to a 4-day week, and in some cases a kind of proper deep green kind of degrowth, decroissance attitude to economics, where we move away from this constant kind of planet destroying modus operandi of just looking for growth all the time. Do you get any sense at all that within the economics profession, either within sort of government or more pertinently within economics departments, any kind of resonance of this within what I might call mainstream economics, or is the discipline carrying on and not stepping outside this kind of professional way of doing business as it has for the last 30 or 40 years?
That's a huge question on which one could have a whole series of lectures. I think that there will certainly, you know, I think this the bits of economics where this will highlight it more in the mainstream is particularly around decarbonization, and there will, I hope, rightly be increasing attention as to, given that there is this major shock and potentially major restructuring at a time when we already have set in policy these long-term challenges of decarbonization, but without a terribly good idea of how we get there. That there will be increasing attention on how we reconcile that, how we use this as an opportunity and take advantage of that. And you've seen some of that today with the Chancellor's announcement about grants for home insulation and the like. I think more broadly, I just hope that there will be more of a focus in economics on the concepts of resilience. What does it look like to have an economy or a broader social and economic system that is resilient to shocks? What have we learned about the strengths and weaknesses of our own system? And remember, in some respects, our system turned out to perform actually quite well. The degree of observation of the lockdown, even by people, groups of people who weren't necessarily at high risk because they felt it was a socially responsible thing to do, had been quite high. The fact on the sort of more market-oriented, the response, I think, of the supermarkets and the supermarket supply chains, and the fact that we haven't had shortages of food anywhere, actually reflects quite well on some aspects of our current economic system. But equally, there are some aspects where we've done badly. Social care is one of them, but not the only one, where we are not nearly as resilient as we may perhaps had thought. And we might have, I hope, more focus on what it is, what a resilient economy and society looks like.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. So the questions are coming in thick and fast. So apologies to people I'm missing. I'm trying to juggle a lot of plates here. But if I'll ask one question on behalf of Rhys Davis, and then if Sin Yi can be ready to ask her question, we'll do it that way. So the question from Rhys Davis is, the distribution of opportunities following a sharp COVID recession is also important. It's not just a case of how far we bounce back. Are there longer term effects on economic inequality, either spatially or between different groups, particularly the most vulnerable in society?
Yes, so it's absolutely clear that both the health and the economic impacts have been very unequal. They've been unequal by age, by gender, by ethnicity, and by income and poverty and class. And clearly, in particular, poorer and more deprived areas and poorer and more deprived people have been hit considerably harder in the short term, both in terms of their vulnerability to COVID, but also in terms of their livelihoods. But whether that is the case, going back to what I said earlier, if that is if that is still the case in 18 months, that will be a policy choice or a policy failure. There's no reason that the after impacts of COVID need to be spatially or economically or ethnically unequal if we get policies right. But it will require positive action by the government. In particular, it will require targeted action and programs that favor areas that have been disadvantaged, that favor groups that are disadvantaged, and as I say, the young unemployed and people in insecure, younger people, especially those in insecure unemployment, it seems to me are those most obviously at risk and where the priority should be. And another reason why I'm hugely more supportive of job creation and targeted attempts to get people into jobs and support jobs and incomes rather than generalized fiscal stimulus.
Sin Yi?
Yeah, I'm ready. Thank you. Jonathan, it's great to see you. Last time, I think it was at the Port Cullis House one with David Coleman on this RSS workshop on how what can we learn about or from migration statistics? Doesn't sound like the government has learned very much. My question is, you mentioned China and an increasingly tense relationship between China and the UK. So all these issues are linked with the 3 million passport Johnson's promising to Hong Kong people. Now, that seems to me a complete U-turn on the Tories' immigration policy all the way back to May or even pre-May, and on which it seems that the whole Brexit is built on. And do you think this is maybe a response to anticipated post-Brexit labour shortage? And why aren't more politicians or pressure groups, particularly the Brexiters, screaming about it? 3 million, a big figure. And with COVID-19 and more unemployment, would this not be seen as letting more immigrants in and taking all the British jobs? So 3 related questions, if I may. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was always a tension on immigration in the Leave camp between the small L liberals and the authoritarian, stroke nationalist, stroke populist, anti-immigration bits. That tension was resolved first when Theresa May became Prime Minister. Although she was a Remainer, notionally, she clearly was very much of the latter camp. And she took the government further down that anti-immigration route. But the government turned around. I mean, Johnson has never been in that camp, and some of the people around him, including those who are influential in this decision, like Dominic Raab, have never been in that camp. And whatever you think of them, I think they are genuine. When they said they didn't want to shut the UK to immigration after Brexit, but rather a different system. I think they did genuinely mean it, and they are genuinely putting that in practice. And that was the case before the Hong Kong issue came on the agenda. Before the system that Johnson, the points-based system, so-called, that Johnson proposed this January, is significantly more liberal than that proposed by Theresa May, which in turn was significantly more liberal than the one she first thought of, but was forced under pressure from within her own government to accept. So we're already heading down a much more liberal, economically liberal route on immigration as of February than we were when Theresa May was Prime Minister. And I think we should recognize that. And yes, there has been some pushback from some of the fringes of the Brexit right, the Farages and the Nick Timothys and the other authoritarian stroke populist, and some academics who are sympathetic to that line, some of my colleagues. But they're on the defensive, and the reason they're on defensive is that public opinion has also turned. And there's a huge debate on why that's the case, but there's no debate on the fact that it's happened. Public opinion is far less worried about immigration and far more relaxed about the impacts of immigration, both economic and cultural, than it was 2 years ago or 4 years ago. And that's very obvious in the opinion polls. So while there are clearly people who don't like this turn, it's not clear that they have a huge amount of political traction at the moment. Could that change? Well, it could. British public opinion on immigration goes in cycles. But at the moment, there really are quite a lot of reasons to be cheerful on this front. And that was before the Hong Kong decision. So what about the Hong Kong decision? I do not think that is motivated primarily by worries about labour shortages. I think it's a combination of a political gesture, and I mean that in the good sense. It's intended as a gesture of defiance to China and solidarity with the people of Hong Kong. And while in that sense it is a gesture, it's still a good one. Partly by economic factors, in the sense that I think this group also thinks the Hong Kong Chinese on the whole would be beneficial to the UK economy. But I don't think it's primarily motivated by saying, oh, we need lots of industrious Hong Kong Chinese to support the economic recovery after Brexit Britain. That may be a second or third order reason for some people, but I don't think it's the main reason. What do I think will actually happen? That's a hard one. I mean, I think you know, it seems to me to be very difficult to make predictions about the likely numbers. But in the central scenario where conditions in Hong Kong, political conditions deteriorate, but there's no mass disorder, generalized repression, or descent into violence and violent repression, then the numbers are much more likely to be in the tens of thousands than hundreds of thousands. You know, if it's just a matter of ending political freedom and repression, I do not think you will see a huge exodus. I was trying to look back at what historical precedents there were here where one could try and make a judgment of likely numbers. And so if you look at Hungary in 1956, after the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution, about 200,000 Hungarians out of a population of 10 million left. And that was after an uprising that was crushed with tanks. If you look at Chile after the Pinochet coup, perhaps 500,000 out of 10 million people left. Again, after a very, very vicious, violent fascist repression. So, you know, if you look at really large mass migrations in the past, they tend to come, you know, that come from, for non-economic reasons, they tend to happen because of ethnic conflicts and or civil wars. So Syria, Yugoslavia, the East African Asians, and so on. All these were civil conflicts, but had a very large ethnic dimension, and that's not really the case here. So my guess, for what it's worth, is that absent something really big, that we will not see millions of people coming.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think we've covered the waterfront, and I think solidarity with the people of Hong Kong is a good place to finish. And apologies we had lots of other questions, but we're running out of time. But the talk will be available on the Wizard website for people who would like to go back and review it. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, but in particular, Jonathan, for giving us such an entertaining and informative talk. We would very much hope that he can come back to Cardiff next year to be with us in the flesh, so to speak. And just a very quick thank you to Chloe MacDonald and Alex Gregory for making this such a smooth lecture. So thank you, diolch yn fawr iawn, and see you all again soon, hopefully. Diolch, Jonathan.
Thank you.